Just before we get started, I do want to say that this video is brought to you by Total AV. Antivirus software is just as relevant today as it was in the past. Get 80% off Total AV through the link in the description below. Right in the heart of downtown San Antonio lies the most mythologized building in American history. The Alamo is a name etched into the consciousness of almost all of us, a place known from movies and TV shows alike. While the building itself is surprisingly small, the stories and characters surrounding it are absolute giants. We all know the names like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. We all know, too, the story of how a force of less than 200 Texans inside its walls held the Mexican army at bay for a week before finally falling in a heroic last stand. But what do we really know of the Alamo itself? A former Catholic mission turned army garrison, the Alamo was constructed in the early 18th century as an outpost of Christendom among the frontier's Apache tribes. Originally a symbol of Spanish dominance, it was only through a fluke of fate that it came to embody the promise of an independent Texas. Forgotten for decades after the revolution, nearly torn down in the 1900s, this is the story of how one small building became an icon of American history. If you're looking for one man to thank for the fact that the Alamo exists at all, look no further than Father Antonio de San Buenaventura y Olivares. A Catholic friar, Father Olivares spearheaded a drive at the dawn of the 18th century to establish Christian missions deep in Native American territory in modern-day Texas. But don't think that he'd be pleased to see just how venerated his mission has become. Father Olivares was a dyed-in-the-wool agent of the Spanish crown. Back in the 1690s, the area around Texas looked very different to how we'd picture it today. The Viceroyalty of New Spain took up not just the whole of Mexico, but extended deep into what we'd now consider America. Not did this vast state actually border the 13 colonies. Back then, French-owned Louisiana was the regional rival, a vast swath of land encompassing parts of some 13 modern states. In both cases, though, Spanish and French control was mostly just theoretical. The frontiers of New Spain were vast tracts of wilderness populated by Native American tribes who responded to Spanish claims of sovereignty with a drawn-out no before going back to whatever they were doing. This meant that it would take only the smallest French invasion force to annex a colossal amount of Spanish territory. Father Olivares' job was to make sure that that did not happen. The friar and others like him would head north onto native lands. At the time, the tribes in the area were in a state of warfare, so the Spanish crown would come and build missions that would offer protection against regional rivals. It was hoped the locals would become loyal supporters of Spain, thus creating an indigenous buffer against the hated French. By 1708, Father Olivares had scouted out the site of modern San Antonio and recommended it as somewhere to establish a Spanish presence. Come 1718, he'd established the first of 5 missions there, Mission San Antonio de Valero, the mission known today as the Alamo. Not that the 1718 Alamo looked anything like today's Alamo. For one, it was a temporary structure. For another, it moved around, changing location several times between 1718 and 1724. Finally, in 1724, the mission settled on its modern-day spot. By 1744, it was successful enough to be transformed into a permanent structure that was made of stone. Over the following decades, Father Olivares and his successors did their best to convert the locals into good Spanish citizens. But while their plan initially met with some success, it soon became apparent that the primary thing the mission was spreading among the natives was not patriotism, but rather deadly smallpox. By the time 1793 rolled around, the elites of New Spain decided the frontier needed more traditional garrisoning and secularized all the missions. It turned out this decision had come just in time. In late 1799, a terrifyingly ambitious, seemingly undefeatable general seized power in France. Known as Napoleon Bonaparte, quickly set about reclaiming French territory that had been lost over the previous century, territory that included Louisiana. With a hostile superpower now suddenly back on their doorstep, New Spain sent the 2nd Flying Company of San Carlos de Parras to garrison the former Mission San Antonio de Valero. Originally dispatched from Alamo de Parras near the Rio Grande, they were more commonly known as Alamo Company. Not long after they garrisoned the mission in 1803, locals started simply referring to it as the Alamo. One of the ironies of Alamo Company's arrival in San Antonio is that they were almost immediately rendered unnecessary. 1803 was the year of the Louisiana Purchase, when Napoleon sold off his newly reacquired territory to the fledgling USA. Suddenly, the chances of a French invasion of New Spain were effectively nil. Still, Alamo Company stayed on at the Alamo. Only now they weren't the first line of defense against Napoleonic hordes, but glorified border guards whose main job was stopping Americans from sneaking into what we'd now call Texas and setting up shop. At least, that was the case until 1810. On September the 16th of that year, Father Hidalgo issued something called the Cry of Dolores, kicking off the Mexican War of Independence. And just like that, Alamo Company found itself caught in the middle of a sprawling civil war. For the first 3 years, things around San Antonio were chaos. Alamo Company was technically meant to be fighting on the side of New Spain, but the reality was that the company fractured. Some joined the ranks of the revolutionaries. At one point, the Alamo itself fell to the pro-Mexican forces. On top of that, American filibusters took advantage of the chaos to try and invade and annex modern Texas. The mess lasted until 1813's Battle of Medina. There, Spanish royalists crushed resistance in San Antonio. Alamo Company came back into the Spanish fold. Incidentally, one of the royalist soldiers at that battle was Lieutenant Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. You know how a TV series might briefly introduce its big bad in episode 1, thus setting him up for later in the season? Well, let's just say that the Battle of Medina was Santa Anna's early season cameo. By 1819, Spain was feeling confident enough that it had this whole Mexican independence thing under control, so it signed a treaty with the US, giving up Florida in return for a clear border between the US and New Spain. Unfortunately, just 2 years later, the Mexicans had kicked the Spanish out and declared a new nation. While this was great from the perspective of not having Madrid lording it over them, it did mean the United States could no longer be trusted to respect the 1819 treaty. So that's how things stood in Texas at the dawn of Mexican independence. In the century plus of Spanish rule, only 3 sizable permanent settlements had been built. On top of that, the Independence War had killed many, leaving Texas even emptier than before. If the new state of Mexico wanted to keep the US out of its northern territories, it was going to have to repopulate them. So the Mexican government decided to import some new subjects. As we saw with filibusters, Americans were just itching to get into northern Mexico and exploit that sweet, fertile land. So the Mexicans, well, they let them. In the early 1820s, Mexico threw open the doors to settlers. In return for living on and fortifying the Mexican border, they would get free lands and exemption from taxes. By the end of 1823, 500 whites had arrived in modern Texas. The next year, Coahuila and Texas came into being as a single state within Mexico. For the Mexicans, the plan seemed perfect: buy the loyalty of new subjects and turn them into staunch defenders of Mexico. But what hadn't worked for the Spanish wouldn't work for the Mexicans. In no time at all, newly independent Mexico was going to find itself home to its very own disloyal independence movement. At this point, we need to take a quick break and survey the people living in Mexican Texas. First, there were the former Spanish-turned-Mexicans, the guys left over from the days of New Spain. In Texas, they were referred to as Tejanos. While highly inaccurate movies might make you think the Tejanos sided with the Mexicans in the coming revolution, that's not the case. As early as 1824, many Tejano families were making common cause with white settlers in agitating for independence. Speaking of those white settlers, they came from all over. While many had started out in the USA, many others came from England, Scotland, Germany, Ireland, wherever really. After settling, they mostly became known as Texians. From the start, many of them had designs on making Texas either an independent republic or a part of the expanding USA. The Texians also brought another, less fortunate group with them. One of the key points selling settlement in Texas for many whites was that Mexico continued to allow slavery in the state. So the third major group in Texas was, unfortunately, slaves. And yes, many of your heroes who died defending the Alamo were also slavers. Early 19th century history, or nothing if not complicated. The final major grouping we should touch on were the native tribes. At the start of the white settlement of Texas, they likely comprised the majority of the population. When the battle finally explodes, just know that all of these groups are going to be there, fighting alongside one another to stave off Santa Anna's army. And with that mention of Santa Anna, it's time to return to our narrative. For the small company based at the Alamo, the 1820s must have been a crazy time. Now Mexican loyalists, they were involved in helping crush both the 1820 1826 Texian Rebellion, and an 1829 attempt by Spain to retake Mexico. Although Spain's half-baked plan of reconquering the Americas went as well as expected, it did have one major effect. The general who led the charge against the Spaniards was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the same Santa Anna we last saw fighting on the Spanish side in the War of Independence. Not that Alamo Company would have stopped to think much about this. They'd have been too busy trying to digest the enormous changes taking place. By the time of Santa Anna's comeback war against the Spanish, over 30,000 white Texians were living in Texas, outnumbering the Tejanos and Mexicans almost 5-1. This huge demographic shift was followed by an equally huge shift in government policy. Getting nervous about the non-loyal whites now living in their northern state, the Mexican authorities rebanned slavery in Texas, hoping to drive the whites away. When that didn't work, they ended the settlement program and tried reinstituting the suspended taxes. Rather than cool the fire of Texian and Tejano resentment, it instead poured gasoline onto it. In 1832, a series of disturbances around modern-day Houston resulted in the Battle of Velasco, in which the Texians and Tejanos drove the Mexican army out of the region. Although they stopped short of seceding, it did leave the Alamo as one of only 2 functioning Mexican army garrisons in the whole of Texas. Still, things hadn't hit an absolute low point yet. There was still enough trust between Mexico and Texas's restive population that when the settlement of Gonzales complained about Native American attacks, Alamo Company lent them a cannon. No one could have known it at the time, but that one cannon would soon become the spark that would set the whole prairie ablaze. Now, just before we get into the rest of today's video, I do want to thank today's sponsor, Total AV, for making it possible. Back in the day when you bought a computer, you got antivirus software, it's just what you did. But today, we don't tend to be so careful, but malware is out there and it is more sophisticated than it's ever been, so everyone should have good antivirus. And yes, that even applies if you have a Mac. One of the biggest problems today is spyware, which can harvest your data and collect personal information on you, such as usernames, passwords, and browsing information. Indeed, last year, hackers stole over 500 million personal records. That's where Total AV comes in, protecting you, keeping you safe against malware, ransomware, spyware, and phishing. Total AV detects and removes viruses, adware, and other things that might be undetected on your computer. You can get 1 year of Total AV Pro Antivirus for just $19.99, which is 80% off, including a VPN. That's just $1.66 a month, and if you're not happy, 30-day money-back guarantee. So please do check them out and support this show through the link below, and let's get back to today's video. The last major action of Alamo Company came on September the 29th, 1835. By now, the strained ties holding Texas within Mexico had completely frayed. 2 years before, Santa Anna had become president of Mexico, a move initially supported by Texians. Then, in 1835, Santa Anna had abruptly scrapped the Constitution and replaced it with something called the 7 Laws. Now, the 7 Laws might more accurately be called the 7 ways Santa Anna will act like a gigantic penis. The laws not only made Santa Anna into a dictator, they removed federalism from Mexico entirely. From now on, Texas would be a mere department run directly from Mexico City. When the news broke, Texas, Zacatecas, and Yucatan all went into rebellion. So Santa Anna crushed them mercilessly. Zacatecas suffered horrendously. Now it was fall, and Alamo Company was being ordered to go and retrieve that cannon that they'd lent to Gonzales. The story of the Gonzales cannon is often told as an example of Texan bravery, but it's more the story of one man's disillusionment. Lieutenant Francisco de Castañeda was the guy heading the force to retake the cannon, and he was super not into Santa Anna's whole "I'm gonna act like a dick" thing. You can see this in the way he only languidly moved on Gonzales, making camp rather than entering the town when challenged by 18 militiamen. You can see it too in the way Castañeda refused to initiate a firefight, preferring instead to hang back. But you can especially see it when the battle finally broke out. On October the 2nd, a group of 140 Texas militiamen attacked the Alamo Company camp, waving flags with pictures of the cannon and the words, "Come and get it." That's the part everyone remembers. The part everyone forgets is that the battle lasted mere moments before Castañeda stopped it and asked to speak to the Texians. In the following parley, Castañeda made it clear that he agreed with the Texians' stated goal of restoring the Mexican Constitution. They even asked him to switch sides and join them. But Castañeda said his honor wouldn't allow him to do so. Then, with a heavy heart, he took his men and retreated, the Gonzales cannon forgotten. A few weeks later, the invigorated Texas army laid siege to the Alamo itself. For nearly 2 months, the soldiers inside held out, desperate to cling on to the only Mexican outpost in the whole of Texas. But on December 9, 1835, Alamo Company finally surrendered. The Texans allowed them to leave unharmed, and 2 days later, they withdrew south of the Rio Grande. Needless to say, Santa Anna was not impressed. As the Tejanos and Texians celebrated, Santa Anna stormed out of his palace and started raising his own army to go and personally take the fight to Texas. Come January 1836, he was riding north at the head of some 7,000 men. If you're picturing Santa Anna leading a band of patriotic Mexicans cheering his name, well, you would be wrong. Over half of Santa Anna's army were indigenous peoples dragooned into fighting for him. They were given no footwear, no decent uniforms, and very few weapons. Just bear in mind when the killing starts that the army besieging the Alamo wasn't comprised of bad guys. It was comprised of men who missed their homes, who were only fighting because they were forced to. On February the 23rd, Santa Anna's men at last sighted a forlorn white building in the distance. It was the Alamo, the same garrison the Mexican army had abandoned only 3 months before, and Santa Anna was determined to take it back. The strangest thing about the Battle of the Alamo is that it shouldn't have happened at all. Although it was on a strategic road, it wasn't that important. Santa Anna could have happily bypassed it without hurting his overall war strategy. But no, Santa Anna's pride had been wounded. And so we find ourselves here, about to witness all 200-odd Texans inside the Alamo get massacred. Speaking of the defenders, it was only through sheer fluke that they were all there. Take Davy Crockett. If anyone can name a single fighter at the Alamo, it's him. A famous frontiersman who'd fought alongside Andrew Jackson in the Creek War, Crockett was the closest thing America had to a celebrity. He'd served as a Tennessee congressman for 3 terms. His survival skills were legendary. But it never intended to come to fight for Texas's independence. He had been preparing a bid for the 1836 presidential election and only taken off after he lost his congressional seat in a shock vote. Jim Bowie was less of a fluke. A former conman and slave smuggler had fled Louisiana for Texas after things got too hot in the 1820s. At the time of the Alamo, he'd taught himself near-perfect Spanish and cultivated deep ties to the Tejano community. And again, we must emphasize that a lot of the Alamo defenders were Tejanos. The last thing we want is people leaving this video still convinced the Alamo was all about heroic blonde settlers sticking it to some swarthy Mexicans. Finally, there was William B. Travis. Travis being at the Alamo was almost as unlikely as Crockett being there. A lawyer by training, Travis had been destined for a life of provincial obscurity, until he happened to get caught up in the 1832 disturbances around modern Houston. After the Battle of Velasco, remember, where the Texans drove the Mexican army out of one of its garrisons, Travis signed up for the local militia in a burst of patriotic fervor. And now here he was, in charge of the enlisted men trying to defend the Alamo. It wasn't an easy task. The Alamo, you see, today is only a fraction of what it once was. Back in 1836, it included a massive 3-acre courtyard surrounded by very low, very thin walls. Fortifying such a massive structure would have been as difficult as building a house out of custard. Not that Travis wasn't going to try, though. On February the 23rd, Santa Anna's forces fired cannons at the Alamo's walls. They flew a red flag, showing there would be no mercy for anyone who surrendered. It was the beginning of a long waiting game for those who were trapped inside. By the time it was over, nearly all of them would be dead. Over the next few days, Santa Anna slowly massed his forces until the Alamo was surrounded by thousands of soldiers. Inside, Davy Crockett played the fiddle to keep the Texan spirits up, while Travis wrote letters, most famously to the friend who was looking after his son. "Take care of my little boy," he wrote. "If the country should be lost and I should perish, he will have nothing but the proud recollection that he is the son of a man who died for his country." Despite the fighting words, though, dying was the last thing anyone wanted to do. While many movies depict the Alamo defenders as stoic men who accepted their fates, the reality is they hoped to get out alive. On March the 5th, as Santa Anna's forces began lashing ladders to the walls in preparation for an all-out assault, the defenders sent a woman out to negotiate a surrender. Santa Anna told her bluntly that there would be no negotiation, only bloodshed. The bloodshed finally came in the early hours of March the 6th. Around 5:30 a.m., Santa Anna sent a force of 1,100 men to take the Alamo. What should have been a sneak attack failed when one officer, perhaps trying to raise the morale of the dragoons' demoralized soldiers, shouted, "Viva Santa Anna!" Inside, Travis responded by yelling, "Come on, boys, the Mexicans are upon us, and we'll give them hell." The next 30 minutes were chaos. Inside the walls, the Texans filled their cannons with scrap metal and turned them on the advancing army, causing injuries so gruesome we don't really want to discuss them. For their part, Santa Anna's men felled Travis with a musket shot through the head. When around 50 Texians inside took fright and tried to escape, they were hacked to pieces with bayonets. By 6 a.m., Santa Anna's men had breached the walls. As their defenders converged on the chapel for a desperate last stand, Jim Bowie was massacred in his sickbed, where he lay dying of typhoid pneumonia. The final end came when a Mexican cannon blew the chapel doors open. Davy Crockett and a tiny handful of survivors were taken prisoner, only for Santa Anna to order them all summarily executed. Less than 40 minutes after it had begun, the legendary Battle of the Alamo was over. By that time, somewhere in the range of 187 to 257 Texians and Tejanos were dead, alongside anywhere between 145 and 600 of Santa Anna's men. Walking among the bodies afterwards, Santa Anna is said to have muttered to himself, "Much blood has been shed, but the battle is over. It was but a small affair." Yet we should point out that not even Santa Anna was completely awful. After the executions of Crockett and the other survivors, he ordered the women and children to be allowed to leave unharmed. He even told his men to free the slaves the Texians had brought with them to defend the mission. It's down to one of these slaves, a man called Joe, who told his tale, that we know what happened at the Alamo at all. Finally, the dead Texans were loaded onto a giant pyre and burned. Crockett, Travis, and Bowie all went up in a cloud of evil black smoke. Santa Anna had won. The fighting was over. The Alamo had fallen. But of course, it wasn't over at all. In the aftermath of the Alamo, Santa Anna won the Battle of Coleto, where another 430 Texian and Tejano prisoners were put to the sword. Unfortunately for Santa Anna, the double massacre made perfect propaganda for the Texans. At the Battle of San Jacinto just a few weeks later, Santa Anna's forces were surprised by an army of Texans yelling, "Remember the Alamo." The 18-minute battle saw 630 of Santa Anna's men slaughtered, including one young drummer boy who was shot through the heart at point-blank range while he begged for his life. It was the first example in history of the legend of the Alamo being used to stir up patriotism, and it certainly would not be the last. In the aftermath, Santa Anna himself was captured. Held for an indeterminate amount of time in Texas, he was finally forced to sign an agreement recognizing Texan independence before being dropped unceremoniously across the border in Mexico. Although Santa Anna returned to his home in disgrace, it wasn't the end for him. Over the course of his career, he would become leader of Mexico 11 more times. Yep, 11 times after he lost a whole bunch of Mexico. I mean, I've never lost any Mexico, and never made me president. Texan independence was proclaimed on March 2nd, 1836, not long after the new republic celebrated by re-legalizing slavery. Again, 19th century politics. It's complicated. But what of the Alamo itself? Well, it might interest you to know that despite its name, there was never only one Battle of the Alamo. Throughout the Texas Republic, the Mexican army tried to reconquer all of their old territory. Since it was right on the road north, the Alamo was repeatedly besieged and occupied. Once Texas joined the U.S., the Mexican incursions stopped, but not the cycle of siege and occupation. In 1861, just as the U.S. Civil War was kicking off, a contingent of Confederate troops surrounded the Alamo and laid siege to the Union soldiers who were gathered there. 4 years later, in 1865, the victorious Union Army would return the favor by surrounding the Confederate troops in the Alamo. In both instances, those inside surrendered without a shot being fired. And so we come to the end of the Alamo story. Beginning in 1876, parts of it began to be sold off until there was nothing left of the historic courtyard that William B. Travis had died defending all those decades ago. By 1903, only the chapel and a few side rooms remained. They were sold to a developer who intended to knock them down, but they were saved after a San Antonio schoolteacher named Adina de Zavala convinced wealthy rancher Clara Driscoll to buy them for the state. Just 5 years later, the state passed a bill turning the Alamo into a protected monument, and while the rest, as they say, is history. But whose history is it? As we've seen today, the history of the Alamo is far more complex and nuanced than is commonly assumed. There were many heroes who spent time there, beyond just the big names that we remember. Heroes like Lieutenant Castañeda, who chose pragmatism over a pointless battle. Heroes like the anonymous slave Joe, who survived the bloodshed to tell the tale. Heroes like the forgotten men of Alamo Company, who served their country through times of upheaval. Or like the anonymous Tejanos, who died defending the Alamo, only to be written out of the history books by those who wanted Texas's foundational myth to be purely and pathetically white. Even the poor wretches in Santa Anna's army, forced at sword point into Texan cannon fire, were brave men who just had the crappy luck of living under an unstable dictator. It said history is written by the victors. In the Alamo's case, history was not just written by the victors, but also edited to scrub the story of its nuances to make it into just a simple myth. Hopefully, with this video today, we've helped bring this fascinating, complex story out of the realm of mythology and back into the realm of history. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. Do not forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, if you enjoyed this video, why not check out our sister channel, Biographics. This channel, it's all about places. That channel's all about people. I'm going to link to it below. And as always, thank you for watching.